Tonight we have news on the American economy and the prices you pay. The new numbers: grocery store prices up from ground beef and steak to fruits and vegetables. Coffee is now up more than 20% from this time last year. Economists on what's driving this. Here's our chief business correspondent, Rebecca Jarvis.
What are your biggest challenges right now?
Groceries. Eggs aren't getting any cheaper. You know, I have a 21-year-old son, my daughter's pregnant, and milk is $4, $5 a gallon, and it's just eating is the hardest part. It's almost becoming cheaper to eat out.
The eggs went from $2 to $9. I'm like, okay, when did we get here?
That's the only downside right now is that we have to pay more to get more groceries.
I mean, they're going up, but
They called it America First, but what if I told you? That same policy just made Africa richer than ever before? Yes, the very tariffs designed to protect American workers are now fueling an unexpected economic boom across the African continent. Factories are rising, ports are expanding, investors from Asia and Europe are pouring in, and all of it began with one man's decision in Washington, D.C. Donald J. Trump. When Trump returned to the world stage and reignited his trade war, the White House thought it was defending American jobs, but something strange happened. While U.S. companies struggled with higher costs, African businesses saw opportunity and they seized it. Because when Trump slapped tariffs on imports from China and Europe, global manufacturers began looking for new partners. Cheaper labor, untapped resources, and trade zones free from U.S.-China tension, and guess what they found? Africa, a continent once ignored, suddenly at the center of the world's new supply chain, from Ethiopia's textile boom to Nigeria's steel revival. From Kenya's assembly plants to South Africa's lithium rush, Africa became the biggest silent winner of Trump's economic war. While America raised walls, Africa opened doors. While Washington cut ties, Africa signed deals. Chinese and Indian investments in African industry up triple digits, and American corporations? They're quietly shifting operations to Africa just to survive the cost shock at home. The irony? Trump's tariff war meant to isolate became the very thing that connected Africa to the global economy like never before. Across Accra, Kigali, and Dar es Salaam, entrepreneurs say the same thing. Trump's tariffs made our products cheaper, our labor more valuable, our exports more visible. When the U.S. blocked Chinese goods, Africa stepped in to fill the gap. Everything from cotton and cocoa to car parts and rare minerals started flowing out of African ports directly to new hungry markets, and suddenly, Africa wasn't just a source of raw materials. It was a manufacturer, a competitor, a beneficiary of America's own trade war. Think about that for a second. The world's largest economy fires the first shot in a global tariff battle, and the loudest echo comes from Lagos, not Los Angeles. The winners are not the Wall Street giants Trump promised to protect, but the young African entrepreneurs now building factories, opening export hubs, and trading in new regional currencies that bypass the US dollar altogether. Because when tariffs make American goods expensive, the world looks elsewhere, and Africa was ready to sell. Let's talk numbers. In 2025 alone, Africa's trade volume with non-US partners grew 54%. Foreign direct investment surged beyond $90 billion, a historic record. And as the U.S. imposed new restrictions, African nations formed new trade corridors with India, Brazil, and the Gulf states. Deals once dominated by Washington, Trump promised to punish China. But Beijing simply rerouted its supply chain through Africa, so Chinese factories set up in Zambia and Tanzania, labeled products made in Africa, and avoided U.S. tariffs entirely. Washington's economists didn't see it coming, Africa's economists did. And as American consumers paid more at home for cars, for clothes, for electronics, African producers quietly expanded. U.S. inflation climbed, African profit margins soared. It was the most unexpected chain reaction in modern trade history. Trump wanted to rebuild American dominance. Instead, he triggered Africa's new golden decade. Now this isn't just about economics, it's about power, because behind every shipment, behind every new trade route, lies a shift in global influence. Africa is no longer the passive partner waiting for aid or charity. It's the active player writing new rules of trade in a game Washington thought it still controlled. And Trump's tariffs? They gave Africa the leverage to demand better deals, to set new standards, to speak with one voice. But here's what the headlines won't tell you. Behind closed doors, American lobbyists are warning Congress, if we don't fix this tariff imbalance, Africa, not China, will dominate emerging markets. Because every time the U.S. raises a tariff, it creates a vacuum, and Africa has learned to fill it faster than any other region on Earth. So the next time you hear America First, remember this story. A policy built on protectionism accidentally became a bridge that carried wealth, trade, and opportunity straight into Africa's hands. Factories that once stood in the American Midwest now hum quietly in Ghana and Rwanda. New African billionaires are emerging. Not by chance but by global redirection. This is the paradox of power in our time. When America fights to hold the world back, the world finds another way forward. Trump's tariff war may have been designed to protect the U.S., but in reality, it just ignited a new chapter of African prosperity. And that right there is the story Washington doesn't want you to know. As America fought to build walls of protectionism, Africa was quietly building something else, bridges of opportunity. When the first wave of Trump's tariffs hit Chinese steel and European machinery, the markets panicked. But in African capitals, trade ministers saw it differently. They saw an opening. China needed cheaper routes, Europe needed alternative suppliers, and Africa, sitting on vast reserves of minerals, energy, and young labor, became the only logical partner left. Factories that once stood idle in Angola and Mozambique came alive again, this time producing for American and European markets. The irony? They were producing the very goods the U.S. had tried to block. In Nairobi, textile hubs began running 24 hours a day. In Addis Ababa, new pharmaceutical plants opened, filling gaps left by disrupted supply chains in India and China. In Nigeria, car assembly lines that once imported parts from Asia now source them locally. Trump's tariffs had forced the world to diversify, and Africa became the biggest beneficiary of the trade reroute. But that's not the whole story. Something much deeper began to shift beneath the surface. Africa wasn't just exporting more, it was learning faster. Every factory built by foreign investors came with new technology, new training, and a new generation of African engineers. They weren't asking for handouts. They were negotiating market share. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, America was paying the price. Tariffs that were supposed to protect American jobs made imported materials more expensive, U.S. manufacturers faced higher costs, and thousands of small factories shut their doors. The Midwest, once the proud heart of America's industry, fell silent again. Inflation climbed, consumer prices soared, and as American shoppers paid more at Walmart and Amazon, African exporters filled the vacuum with affordable goods. The America First dream slowly turned into an Africa First reality. Let's look at the data Washington doesn't like to show. Between 2021 and 2025, U.S. exports to Africa fell by 18%, but African exports to the rest of the world jumped by nearly 65%. The reason? African products became the cheaper, faster alternative, born directly from the pressure of Trump's tariff wars. In Lagos, a young entrepreneur named Amara built a small electronics assembly company. When U.S. tariffs drove up the cost of Asian imports, global distributors started sourcing from her because her prices beat the Chinese market. Her company now employs 600 people and exports to 3 continents, and she's not alone. Across Africa, thousands of small firms are stepping into roles once dominated by foreign suppliers. But there's something even more fascinating. Trump's tariffs didn't just make Africa richer, they made Africa smarter. The African Continental Free Trade Area, AfTA, once just an ambitious dream, suddenly became necessary. Nations realized that to take advantage of global trade wars, they needed to trade more with each other. By 2025, intra-African trade hit its highest level in history. Goods moved seamlessly across 40 countries, from copper in Zambia to textiles in Egypt, from cocoa in Ghana to tech parts in Kenya. Trump's tariffs had unintentionally fueled Africa's internal unity, and as the U.S. doubled down on isolation, Africa doubled down on integration. While Washington raised tariffs, Africa lowered them for its neighbors. While the U.S. government tightened trade barriers, African leaders signed new bilateral deals across the continent. The global order was quietly flipping. For the first time in modern history, Africa wasn't reacting to a Western crisis, it was benefiting from it, and the world began to notice. European investors called it the Africa advantage. Asian companies called it the next supply chain frontier. But inside Washington, some officials called it what it really was: a geopolitical backfire. A senior U.S. trade advisor, speaking off record, admitted, Trump's tariffs were meant to isolate China, but all they did was push global trade through Africa. We basically gave Africa a free pass into the new economy. The U.S. media doesn't say much about it, but behind closed doors, American lobbyists are lobbying to reverse course, to reopen trade with the same African nations they once overlooked. Because while America debated politics, Africa built ports. While Washington fought culture wars, Africa fought for contracts. And while the U.S. economy struggled to stay afloat, Africa was quietly becoming the anchor of global production. Today, when you walk through the industrial zones of Nairobi or the tech parks of Kigali, you can feel it, the quiet hum of a continent rewriting its own destiny. And somewhere in the irony of history, a policy once meant to make America great again has given rise to something even bigger: a new, confident, self-sufficient Africa. The Africa that manufactures, the Africa that negotiates, the Africa that no longer waits for permission to rise. Trump's tariff war was supposed to be America's comeback story. Instead, it became Africa's awakening. And as the dust settles on this global trade battlefield, one truth remains undeniable. The 21st century's new winners won't be the ones who built walls, but the ones who built bridges, and Africa is building faster than anyone else. Once upon a time, the world's economy revolved around Washington. Every trade route, every deal, every dollar flowed through the U.S. system, but not anymore. Trump's tariff war didn't just backfire, it reshaped the very architecture of global commerce. Because while America was fighting to hold its ground, Africa was busy building new ground. Africa is no longer just a supplier of minerals or raw materials, it's a producer, a hub, a negotiator. The ripple effects of Trump's trade policies have turned Africa into a bridge between East and West, a neutral zone where China, Europe, and the Gulf compete for influence, and in that competition, Africa profits. Trump's America First tariffs made the U.S. an unpredictable partner, so global investors from Beijing to Berlin shifted their bets to Africa. They built roads in Tanzania, power plants in Ghana, tech campuses in Kenya, and they paid in local currencies, not U.S. dollars. The de-dollarization wave that Washington feared is being fueled by the very tariffs it imposed. The result? For the first time in modern history, trade between African nations and the global South surpasses trade with the United States. That's right, America is no longer Africa's biggest economic partner, and that's not just a statistic, it's a turning point in world power. Inside Washington, analysts are beginning to admit what once sounded impossible. Trump's tariff war didn't isolate China, it accelerated the formation of a new multipolar world with Africa right at its heart. Let's call it what it is, a power shift. In just 5 years, Africa went from the periphery of world trade to the pivot. Ports in Djibouti and Mombasa now handle rerouted shipping lines once dominated by Singapore. Ethiopian Airlines carries more international cargo than some U.S. carriers, and Africa's regional digital payment systems built through a Freximbank are allowing transactions outside the dollar for the first time ever. Meanwhile, in the U.S., the picture is darker. Farmers face higher export costs, tech firms complain of component shortages, and small businesses once promised revival under America First are closing under the weight of the very tariffs meant to protect them. Trump's economic wall became a mirror reflecting America's isolation back at itself, and while Washington blames foreign rivals, Africa keeps building, trading, exporting, thriving. The numbers tell a new story of dominance. Africa's trade with China, $282 billion and growing. Africa's trade with India, $120 billion and accelerating. Africa's trade with the U.S., down 40% since Trump's first tariffs. And yet, American companies are quietly moving back not to the U.S. but into Africa. Car manufacturers, tech firms, energy giants. They're setting up in Nigeria, Kenya, and Rwanda because production there is cheaper and demand is rising. Here lies the paradox no one in Washington dares to say aloud. Trump's tariffs, meant to protect America, have created a new generation of African industrial powerhouses, ones that now compete directly with the U.S. itself. Africa has found its leverage, and leverage is the new currency of global power. When the U.S. raises tariffs, Africa raises prices on the resources America needs. When Washington imposes sanctions, Africa sells to the East. And when the West looks away, Africa looks inward to its own market of 1.4 billion consumers. That's not just resilience, that's reinvention. The AfTA, once just a vision, is now one of the world's most powerful economic blocs. It connects economies from Cape Town to Cairo, creating a unified trade zone larger than the European Union. And here's the twist. Trump's tariffs, though aimed at reviving American manufacturing, pushed Africa to finally manufacture for itself. For decades, the West told Africa to stay in its lane, export raw materials, import finished goods. Not anymore. Today, Africa makes its own steel, its own fabrics, its own tech parts. It's not made in China or made in America, it's made in Africa. So as Trump's America grapples with inflation, job loss, and divided politics, Africa is writing a different headline, one few expected to see so soon. A headline that reads, "The 21st century belongs to those who adapt," and Africa just did, because every policy has a price, and every backfire lights a fuse. Trump's tariff war was meant to reignite American power. Instead, it ignited Africa's transformation. For decades, the world called Africa the sleeping giant, but in the echoes of America's tariff war, that giant finally woke up, and this time, it's not going back to sleep.